Foundation Module 1, UHS Modular Integrated Undergraduate Curriculum Physiology, Dr. Sheen, CEO and Founder Medical Superfast. Simplified Physiology Video Lecture Notes, Guyton and Hall 14 edition. Chapter number 4, Lecture number 13, page number 59-60. Learning Objective. Discuss functions and significance of sodium, potassium, ATP ASE pump. Dear guys, you will learn in this lecture: definition of sodium, potassium pump, basic components of the sodium, potassium pump, functions and significance of sodium, potassium pump, electrogenic nature of the sodium, potassium pump. Definition of sodium, potassium pump. It is a transporter that pumps sodium ions outside through the cell membrane of all cells, and at the same time pump potassium ions from the outside to the inside. Basic components of sodium, potassium pump. The carrier protein is a complex of two different globular protein, a larger one called the alpha subunit, smaller one called the beta subunit. The function of the smaller protein is not known, except that it might anchor the protein complex in the lipid membrane. The larger protein has three specific features. It has 3 binding sites for sodium ions on the portion of the protein that protrudes to the inside of the cell. It has 2 binding sites for potassium ions on the outside. The inside portion of this protein, near the sodium binding sites, has ATP ASE activity. When 2 potassium ions bind on the outside of the carrier protein and 3 sodium ions bind on the inside, the ATP ASE function of the protein becomes activated, then this break one molecule of ATP into ADP and releasing high-energy phosphate bond. This liberated energy is then believed to cause a chemical and conformational change in the protein carrier molecule, move 3 sodium ions to the outside and 2 potassium ions to the inside. Note, keep in mind, for some cells, such as electrically active nerve cells, 60 to 70% of the cell's energy requirement devoted to pumping sodium out of the cell and potassium into the cell. Functions and significance of sodium, potassium pump. It maintains sodium and potassium concentration differences across the cell membrane. It also establishing a negative electrical voltage inside the cells. The sodium-potassium pump is important for controlling cell volume. How it controls cell volume. Inside the cell are large numbers of proteins and other organic molecules that cannot escape from the cell. Most of these proteins and other molecules are negatively charged and therefore attract large numbers of potassium, sodium, and other positive ions. All these molecules and ions then cause osmosis of water to the interior of the cell. Unless this process is checked, the cell will swell indefinitely until it bursts. The normal mechanism for preventing this outcome is the sodium-potassium pump. This mechanism pumps 3 sodium ions to the outside of the cell for every 2 potassium ions pumped to the interior. The membrane is less permeable to sodium ions than to potassium ions. Once the sodium ions are on the outside, they have a strong tendency to stay there. This process represents a net loss of ions out the cell, which also initiates osmosis of water out of the cell. If a cell begins to swell for any reason, the sodium-potassium pump is automatically activated, moving more ions to the exterior and carrying water with them. Significance of sodium-potassium pump. The sodium-potassium pump performs a continual surveillance role in maintaining normal cell volume. It is vital for cellular function. It stabilizes the resting membrane potential of cells. It produces action potentials in nerve cells. It is used by kidneys to maintain sodium and potassium balances in the body. It plays a role in maintaining blood pressure and controls cardiac contractions. Electrogenic nature of the sodium-potassium pump. The sodium-potassium pump moves 3 sodium ions to the exterior for every 2 potassium ions to the interior. Net 1 positive charge is moved from the interior of the cell to the exterior of the cell for each cycle of the pump. This action creates positivity outside the cell but leaves a deficit of positive ions inside the cell, causes negativity on the inside. Therefore, the sodium-potassium pump is said to be electrogenic because it creates an electrical potential across the cell membrane. Electrical potential is a basic requirement in nerve and muscle fibers for transmitting nerve and muscle signals.